Thank you everybody for joining. It's my personal pleasure and honor to introduce Keisha Williams from the Director of the Workplace Equality Program at HRC as our keynote speaker for Blank Factors, part of Blank Factors, the diversity and inclusion initiatives in the context of Pride Month for 2022. Keisha has an impressive background of over a decade practicing law, served as in-house counsel at various labor unions, collaborating with high-level officials on workplace equality initiatives. Currently a professor of law, she serves on different boards of directors, including Georgetown University Law Center's Workplace Streetlaw program. She furthermore holds a bachelor's of business administration with a concentration in finance with honors from Howard University. We're awfully glad to have been able to collaborate with the HRC, an organization that has been termed as the largest LGBTQ civil rights group in the USA, a definite leader in the fight for LGBTQ plus rights in the nation, with over 40 years creating the most powerful movement for equality in the United States has ever seen to ensure that all LGBTQIA plus people, particularly trans, people of color, and HIV plus, are treated as full and equal citizens of the world. We're proud to host this 20-minute event for key public insight on fostering workplace diversity and inclusion measures for our talent around the globe. So Keisha, please feel free to take up all the space in the room. Thank you for joining us today.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for having me. I love getting to engage with folks during Pride Month. It's a really incredible month. And I know folks always think about, what does Pride mean? And for me, Pride really just means celebrating authenticity. So each of us acknowledging that we have something unique to provide to the world, to our workplaces, to our colleagues, and having a month to celebrate that, but hopefully bringing that same focus on authenticity throughout the year and making that really a staple of our individual journeys as well as journeys as a company. So it's thrilling to be here. And again, thank you for the introduction. My name is Keisha Williams. I do use she, her pronouns, and I am the director of the Workplace Equality Program. So I want to just talk you through the agenda really quickly, and then we'll go ahead and jump into some material. So I'm going to provide a bit more background on the Human Rights Campaign for folks who are not familiar with the organization. I'm going to talk specifically about the Workplace Equality Program that I lead and the importance of the workplace as it relates to inclusion. We're going to talk a little bit about why inclusion matters, both it being the right thing to do, but also the business case for inclusion and how it's really a catalyst for growing an organization. Next, we'll talk about starting your diversity and inclusion journey and what that looks like and a couple of steps to help you navigate the process. And then lastly, I'll share some education and resources that we have at the Human Rights Campaign that are going to be really helpful for you, whether you're an individual employee that's trying to figure out how to be more inclusive, or if you are leading the organization and trying to figure out how your organization can actually make an impact. So first, the Human Rights Campaign is the largest civil rights organization fighting for LGBTQ plus folks around the world. We have a lot of our work in the US, but we do work globally as well, and have really been working for many years to make society better, to ensure that folks can live authentically without fear and with equality under the law. So we have about 3 million supporters who both are mobilized to address, let's say, legislation that is harmful to the community, but are also just supporters and allies who are wanting to help advance equality across the board. And the organization really has two components. We have a public policy arm that deals with lobbying, legislation, and other political work. And we have an educational arm that does education, research, and other work that really helps to propel society forward. So the Workplace Equality Program that I lead is under this educational arm, but we have lots of programming that helps to, for example, destigmatize folks being HIV positive. We have programming that seeks to economically empower trans employees in the workplace. We have a lot of programming in many areas, but one of the things that we found is that we all spend so much time at work, oftentimes more time than we spend with our friends and families. So it's critically important that the workplace is a central focus of our work because it's really a pillar of what equality means. Individuals being able to be in the world, to make a living, support their family, and to do so authentically. So the Workplace Equality Program at HRC has been working to drive inclusion in workplaces for 20 years. And the primary vehicle that we utilize is the Corporate Equality Index. So the Corporate Equality Index is really just a tool for companies. It establishes benchmarks for how to be inclusive, and it gives companies a roadmap on what an inclusive environment looks like. Some of the pillars that you'll see in this index, which are really important for having an inclusive environment, are one, workplace protections, ensuring that your workplace non-discrimination policies expressly prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We have a number of policies and practices that we recommend around healthcare. LGBTQ plus folks, and specifically trans employees, have historically been discriminated against in the healthcare system and haven't been able to access very basic care because of exclusions in those healthcare policies. So it's critically important that companies review their policies and are aware of areas where there is a lack of inclusion. So we require companies to have insurance benefits that are inclusive of transgender employees, and also ensuring that their benefit offerings are the same for legal spouses and domestic partners, regardless of gender. And a huge component of what our criteria also requires is policies and practices around internally engaging with employees. So having employee resource groups to create a sense of community where employees can come together, have discussions about their work environment, growth areas, and have really a relationship with a senior level official who can help bring life to those ideas within the organization. Having robust training and education programs where you're giving employees with the tools that they need to be inclusive in the workplace. And you're telling employees about what inclusion looks like. So if I'm an employee in the workplace, what are the expectations of me if I want to be an ally or I want to be inclusive in the workplace as well? And finally, we have criteria around external engagement with the LGBTQ plus community. So for organizations as a whole, taking a look at what your marketing looks like, what your recruitment efforts are. If you provide philanthropic support, what your philanthropic giving illustrates. Because employees, prospective employees, businesses that you collaborate with, consumers, investors, they're all wanting to know what your company's values are. So it's critically important that internally you know what those values are, employees know what those values are, and your organization can really live into those values and have that be a guiding pillar as your organization grows and develops. So one topic that is always one of interest as folks are starting their diversity and inclusion journeys and trying to figure out, does inclusion matter? Why does it matter? What does that look like from a workplace perspective? So one of the things that we often do is gather research and data to help capture what inclusion looks like in the workplace and how discrimination has an impact. So one of the things that we know about discrimination across the board, whether you're talking about LGBTQ workers or other marginalized groups, is that discrimination has an economic impact. And we have some statistics here that just tell you a little bit of information about the economic impact on LGBTQ plus folks. So first, LGBTQ plus folks have higher rates of both poverty and unemployment. And this was exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we know that there is an impact on folks being able to attain employment and retain that employment to just make a living for their families. Second, the wage gap. So the wage gap is significant, especially for transgender employees. So for transgender men, they're making 70 cents on the dollar for an equitable employee in a similar position. And for transgender women, it's about 60 cents on the dollar. So there is a huge economic impact there that companies should be aware of and really assessing in their own work environments to see whether or not there is a wage gap and how you can bridge that gap. Next, here are some stats that really are talking about LGBTQ plus folks at work. And many employees assume, I don't think I have any colleagues who are part of the LGBTQ plus community or who are attuned to what's going on with respect to that community. But what we found is statistics show that that is not an accurate assessment. 50% of folks think they don't have any LGBTQ plus colleagues, but about half of the folks who are LGBTQ plus are not out at work. So you often don't know who your colleagues are that are a part of the community. And I remember many years ago, I started working, I had a new job, I was excited, and I had a colleague who made a very inappropriate comment about LGBTQ plus folks. And I pulled that person aside, I had a conversation with them, other colleagues did the same, but every single time I saw that individual, that's what I thought about. I wasn't thinking about my work. I wasn't thinking about collaborating with that individual. I kept thinking about how much that comment bothered me. And that's eventually what happens in the workplace. When you have a workforce where folks don't know how to be inclusive, where folks are making inappropriate comments, people are not thinking about their work. They're not productive. They're thinking about how uncomfortable they felt, how unsafe that they feel in the workplace. So it's important for us as individuals, for us as leaders, to think about how we're showing up in the workplace and how we can be a tool for inclusion rather than one that's going to create an environment where folks don't feel comfortable, don't feel safe, and feel discriminated against. And in that same vein, 53% of folks, so more than half of the folks who are in the workplace and who are part of the LGBTQ plus community have heard these inappropriate remarks that are really a barrier for them and for other colleagues who are bothered by those kinds of comments. And lastly, a third of LGBTQ plus workers reported discrimination in the workplace. So whether you are aware or not aware of colleagues in your workplace being part of the community, what we know is that most of the folks who are a part of the community are not out at work. They are experiencing inappropriate comments. Many of them are experiencing discrimination, and that's having an impact on folks being able to do their jobs, folks being able to collaborate, and folks being able to feel safe at work. So we know that it's having an impact, and research across the board for decades has illustrated that fact, that there is an actual impact. And in terms of the business case, so as an organization, as an employee, why does inclusion matter? How does this impact the organization? So here are some of the ways where we are finding the most impact. And the Human Rights Campaign works with about 1,300 large organizations on their workplace equality and inclusion. And this is the consistent feedback that we're receiving from all of those organizations. The ones that are growing, the ones that are well-established are providing the same feedback. One is companies spend a lot of time on recruitment. And when you are in the recruitment process, you want to attract top talent. In order to attract that top talent, employees are going to want to know what the company's values are, and diversity and inclusion has been top of mind for candidates who are seeking employment. So recruitment is a huge factor in having an inclusive environment. Retention is second. What we know is that folks who are in environments that are not inclusive are willing to leave solely because that environment is not inclusive. And folks are even more so willing to stay because the environment is inclusive. So in order to retain folks within your organization, it's critically important that it's an inclusive environment. Next is absenteeism. So basically, how often are folks calling out of work? Are they out of work for extended periods of time? Are your colleagues out of work and then you're having to pick up work for them? All of those impacts can be traced directly to not having an inclusive environment. So again, that inclusion is going to be impacting the company and the colleagues within that work environment. Next is productivity. That goes back to the example I mentioned. I heard that inappropriate comment, and that's what I was thinking about every time I saw that colleague. I was not thinking about work. It was a barrier to collaboration. So it really does reduce productivity. Next, innovation. Especially for new and growing companies, you want your employees to feel safe because it is a pathway for creativity, for innovation, for those ideas that are going to change how much of an impact your company can have in its business. So not having inclusion, again, is going to be a barrier in that space. And then lastly, it's a market imperative. We have employees come to us, we have companies come to us, and they're thinking, how can I be more inclusive? My customers are demanding it. The organizations I'm partnering with are demanding it. My employees are demanding it. So the market is now requiring more of companies. It's tough for now for companies to just do a business and not say anything and not have any values. It's critically important that companies are aware of and establish their values and ensure that those values are really intertwined within the work that the organization does as it thinks about the work product and how to make a broader impact. And diversity and inclusion seems like a daunting task. Folks are always like, I'm not sure where to start. There is so much to be done. Where do I begin? That is a very, very common thought, whether you're an individual thinking about it or if you're, running an organization and you're thinking about it. But one of the things that I always want to mention is that diversity and inclusion is a journey and it is not a destination. So really, it's about making a commitment to the journey. So that means being in a phase and a process of growth, of learning, of constantly wanting to improve, almost like a relationship is what I'll call it. So you have to just be committed to the journey. And as long as you start somewhere, you can, have lots of growth, progress, and success, and you'll never be able to imagine where you'll end up in that journey, but you just have to start. So for folks who are thinking about it, I would encourage you all to just start somewhere, and wherever you start is where you're destined to start, and you can continue from there. So first, I try to give a couple of steps for organizations and for folks to think about how to be inclusive. So first is your company values. Does your organization have company values? Are they expressly spelled out? Have employees had an ability to weigh in on what the values are that they want in their workplace? That's a great place to start, because without having company values, expectations are not going to be clear for employees. The goals that you're working towards are not going to be clear for employees. So really having company value systems. Our organization values creating a diverse and inclusive environment because we know that's a catalyst for growing and improving in our business product lines. Whatever that is, make sure that it's clear and prioritize putting those values into action. Because having an inclusive environment is going to take time. It's going to take a commitment from senior level folks in the organization and every individual employee within the organization as well. So making sure that there is clarity around that. And one note that I'll mention here is that our society is in a space where there's a significant level of division, where folks cannot have a conversation about disagreements. And values are a pathway for you to bridge that gap, because everyone has a right to feel and think how they feel and think, right? But when we're in the workplace, as an employee, you're making a commitment to be in this workplace and to follow the company rules, regulations, and ultimately uphold those values, because that's what's required of you as an employee. So those values are really the middle ground where you can have those conversations. So it's not about individual perspectives out in the world, but rather about the company's expectations for me as an employee. So it's really important that those values are established. Next is empower your employees and leadership. And this is a really important factor, because no one is born an expert on diversity and inclusion. Even folks who are in the community still have lots of growth and development to do. So as a company, it's critically important that you empower your employees and your leadership by providing folks with training, resources, education, not just during Pride Month, but throughout the year, and making sure this is a part of your leadership development training, your new hire training, and all aspects of how you educate and engage with your employees. Because if you don't provide employees with the tools that they need, it's hard for them to engage in a fashion that's inclusive, because they don't know what inclusion looks like. They haven't been given direction. So that's a huge component of what it takes to really build a more inclusive environment, giving folks the tools that they need. And one note I have in step 2 is having the tough conversations about unconscious bias. And this is a really key component, because unconscious bias is really just the concept of folks having thoughts or their brain being pre-programmed to think things about people, whether it's of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, gender identity, or any other factor. So folks, because they're not consciously aware of it, you have to have conversations to kind of bring this out and help folks understand what their bias may be and how that impacts them in their day-to-day life. So you need to have that training and education as a foundation before you can have those tough conversations about inclusion, about bias, and about how that is impacting the workplace. Next is assess your workplace. So the Corporate Equality Index is one vehicle for you to do so. You can also do employee surveys. There are a lot of different ways for you to assess the workplace, but really an honest evaluation of your policies, your practices, and your organizational culture. So how you can do better. So what you can establish more firmly with your policies, how you can utilize your employees to put those policies in practice, and how you can really make a change to the organizational culture. So that is critically important to make an assessment, identify those areas that are most pressing, and work towards them. And lastly, stay on the journey. Again, there's no destination that you're trying to reach, but it's really just this commitment. So think about what you can do to continue this commitment and how you can stay encouraged and be a beacon of hope in times where there are challenges, which there will be, but knowing that staying on this journey is really going to be huge, both for individuals and for the organization. So the Human Rights Campaign has a lot of resources. And here are some of the resources that I've referenced today that I'll make sure to send over and that can be shared more broadly. So Workplace Divided, this is our climate research to give you an understanding of the experience of LGBTQ+ workers in the workplace. We have another recent report with respect to wages to tell you a little bit about the wage gap and how that impacts folks around the country. A huge resource that I highly recommend is Allyship in the Workplace. So this is a guide that gives you as an individual employee an understanding of what it means to be an ally and how you can be a real catalyst for inclusion in your workplace. Because one of the things that we found is inclusion is broad policies in healthcare, but inclusion is also, I'm having a conversation at a water cooler. Everyone is talking about their weekend and whether or not I feel safe sharing my weekend with my wife and what we did with our family, right? So it's both the granular and those macro concepts. And I think this Allyship in the Workplace guide is a real tool for helping folks to understand how they can have those small and grand impacts on the workplace. Next is our criteria for the 2023 Corporate Equality Index. So if you're trying to do an assessment, if you don't know where to start, you can take a look at this criteria and it gives a roadmap on what your policy should be, how to make them more inclusive, and what you can do going forward. And then lastly, we have a free webinar series called The Look Forward, and we discuss different topics every month. So we may be speaking about inclusive healthcare or transgender inclusion in the workplace, or emerging topics in diversity and inclusion. It is a free webinar series. Folks are open to join. We also have a repository of the recorded sessions. So if you feel like I just need some guidance on XYZ topic, I'm curious, it's a free webinar series that we encourage you all to participate in. And lastly, I will leave you all with two thoughts. One is, how are you uniquely positioned to make an impact in your workplace? So can you be the person who is making sure you're bringing colleagues in during those water cooler conversations? Can you be the person who is an ally and who proudly wears their flag pin throughout the year and tries to be a resource for employees? Think about what you individually can do, because that's how you change the world, person by person, conversation by conversation. No act is too small to make an impact. So think about what impact you can make. And from a company perspective, think about what your company is uniquely positioned to do and how that can make a broader impact. An example I like to give is Brooks Running Shoes. It's a running shoe company, and you may be thinking, how can they get involved in LGBTQ equality and inclusion? But they thought about, okay, we are a running company, let's utilize that. So they had a running campaign that was all about trans runners and athletes in all sports. And it was a really powerful and impactful campaign and a way for them to really get engaged, because there has been historic legislation that's been targeting transgender folks and especially transgender youth. And they wanted to make an impact, and it was huge. So think about your company, what your company does, and how you can make a broader impact, and just start and have the conversation. And you never know what kind of impact you can make. And how that's going to enable your company, not just to be a great company, but also to be a good corporate citizen and be more and even greater than you could have imagined. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for all the knowledge shared, Keisha. That really sets a little bit of a milestones for us as we, group and think about how do we get this journey going, moving further, where do we go, what our north is. So thank you for that valuable insight. As part of the questions that we have here is how do we, so job descriptions, for instance, how can we work on these to portray or accommodate a more inclusive environments type of like generics? I'll leave that one at that to begin with.
Sure. So first, I would say in your job description, one of the things that you want to make sure that you include is those values that we're talking about. So whether it's at the top where you're describing the company or at the bottom of the job announcement, being forward with the fact that we are a company that values diversity and inclusion. We do not discriminate based on XYZ factors. And this is a huge aspect of what we want in a candidate in the company. So I think that is a good first step, is thinking about ensuring all of your announcements have very specific language about the company's values and about their values around diversity and inclusion. And I would also really just take a look at the job announcement to see if there are areas of bias. Because one of the things that we've been working with companies to do now is looking at policies and seeing, are those policies or is this job announcement tailored towards folks without disabilities or tailored towards folks that may have a specific background. So really just looking at your job announcements, I would say more holistically and less about the granular duties in the job, but more about what overall message is this announcement sending to potential candidates? Am I not connecting with or communicating to candidates that I may want to bring into my organization by virtue of how that announcement is written or how I'm describing the position? Or maybe if I'm using gender terminology within the description to talk about the role. So those are some of the things you can do as you're really thinking through how to make a job announcement more dynamic and really communicate the message that you want to candidates.
Absolutely. And in terms of that language use, do you think, so in terms of like the main channels to get this out are the thoughts of a manifesto, for instance, on diversity and inclusion, are these helpful or are these counterintuitive, or what would be the impressions on these kinds of, I guess, public statements, company-wide, right? And
yeah, so we absolutely encourage companies to make these kinds of public statements on their website and just utilizing your platform. Companies have such an ability to communicate with employees, with prospective employees without saying anything. And if that's something that you have on your landing page, for example, that's going to already show employees and prospective employees about what your values are. And when you don't say anything, you're leaving employees and prospective employees with guesswork. They're not quite sure about what to think of your organization. So sending a more clear message and being transparent about your values is critically important.
Okay, beautiful. And then lastly, I do have a couple more. If we were wanting to touch base on the best practices precisely for these people who identify as part of the LGBTQIA plus community, but are being impacted by this exclusion. So in terms of allyship, or for any allies noticing finger pointing, in their interest to mitigate the possibility of attrition, what would be the best approach, let's say, quote unquote, best approach of a situation for a person who's impacted, but not yet fully out also in the workplace? If we're noticing that many of our LGBTQIA folks do not feel safe to come out in the workplace, then how do we impact as allies that level of impact internally would be the question Stephen's throwing our way.
Sure. So one I would say is to have a vehicle for folks to be able to share concerns anonymously. So if I am not out in the workplace, I am not going to want to potentially out myself by directing a comment to my colleague directly, or I may not want to publicly reach out to HR, for example. So having a vehicle for folks to be able to communicate with HR and with other leadership anonymously is going to be very helpful, especially if employees are not 100% sure about what your values are, or they're not 100% sure about whether it's safe, providing those channels so you can still receive the information, but not requiring folks to actually come out would be critically important.
Okay, and just the last one on a personal note, I was quite interested in knowing the diversity and inclusion initiatives. Just the concept of diversity goes so much broader than our sexual and our gender identifications, right? But as we fight for diversity and inclusion as a whole, these other factors, so race, ethnicities, spirituality, religion, so many class, right? There are so many other factors that might be impacted negatively in a working environment that we would love to incorporate as part of our diversity and inclusion, making everybody feel safe for how they identify. And even though you had said, you know, the political, cultural, social associations that we bring into the workplace, even though we are working on common ground values, I guess what I'm trying to go to is how do we, all these measures that we're incorporating, how do we unveil how they go much more beyond the sexual and gender identifications scope into like the integrity and natural diversity of human beings as a whole?
Sure. So that's a really incredible question. And it's something that we have thought about pretty extensively internally, and we've modified our criteria around that. So there's this concept called intersectionality. It's a concept first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it really just talks about the intersection of all of our identities. So I am a Black woman, I am a lesbian, I am, I have all of these intersections. I'm first generation American with a family of immigrants. So all of those things create a unique identity for me. And other folks within the LGBTQ plus community, for example, a gay white man is not going to have the same experience that I have. So intersectionality is really about understanding and assessing each individual's unique identity and what barriers and structures that creates for them as they're trying to feel safe in the workplace. They're trying to thrive in the workplace and grow and improve. So it really is thinking about the interrelationship of all of our identities, and DEI work is really one large umbrella that captures many things. It's not siloed where you can have efforts specific only to the LGBTQ plus community and thinking that doesn't have a broader impact. It absolutely does. So I think really sort of educating folks on how each of us has a unique identity and how that impacts our experience is a first step in really figuring out what the company can do and how the company can take that into account when developing its diversity and inclusion strategies. Absolutely.
We do have a human resources talents concerned about live events. So when we do bring people into the office, and COVID has changed a little bit of this, right? Like the remote work and going into the office and meeting at that physical space being even more important right now. Everybody, I believe people are a little bit more conscientious of their personal space and interaction as, slowly coming in and building that culture together. So the concern here is what measures to take into account for inclusive, making everybody feel comfortable within that, space of new gathering, let's say, for that initial touch base points.
Sure. So one I would say is setting the tone about the conversation and the goals thereof. So one of the things I always do if I'm having these kinds of conversations or closed door conversations is saying this is a safe space. No question is a bad question, that we are in an environment to learn, and making sure that folks know that that's the purpose of that conversation. One of the tools I also mentioned was Mentimeter, which is really a technology integration tool where folks can be able to weigh in anonymously and not have to feel like I don't want to ask the question and folks are thinking, how is it that so-and-so doesn't know this? So creating those opportunities where you can say, how comfortable are you with workplace equality and inclusion for LGBTQ plus workers? And you can answer on a scale of 1 to 10 and get the collective group response. Or is there a question that you have that you're not comfortable asking? And you can be able to put that in the Mentimeter and get your question answered and not feel like you're going to be judged by something that you don't know. So having, certainly parameters around respectful interactions, but also making sure it's a safe space, because if you don't have the conversation, you're not really going to be able to make the growth and progress that you need.
Okay. And just to, as a wrap up, we touch base on a little bit of US based speakers, and I know HRC is working globally. Can we touch a little bit upon the geographical, social political context? Basically, America as a continent, and perhaps Europe, other latitudes. Do we have any markers, differentiators here? Something's just coming out very clearly of differences between the North, global South, these kinds of variations. Do we already know a little bit of data in terms of diversity and inclusion in these latitudes by any means?
So it just depends on where it is. We also have programs that I manage in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. So we have a lot of data and information in connection with the business community there. And we partner a lot with organizations in other countries, but we by no means have sort of a global landscape. LGBTQ plus equality and inclusion overall, taking aside the workplace, is so different in every country. And there are so many social nuances in every country. So we are sort of working on an ad hoc basis to help and partner with organizations that are on the ground in each of those countries, but we by no means have, I would say, data and statistics on sort of the world. There are some places where everyone is closeted because it's so unsafe that it's not really worth the risk. And there are other places where it's a bit more socially accepted. There is more laws in place that protect individuals, like in the States, but it's a very, very wide spectrum as it relates to that.
So localization, reaching out to organizations basically on the ground in each specific location in which we operate would seem like a good point of action, no?
Yes.
To be able to, to
Yes.
define.
And there are other survey tools that are similar that provide roadmaps for companies in countries where we don't operate. Like Stonewall, for example, has a survey tool to help companies along in Europe. So there are different organizations. So if you can find civil rights organizations in those countries, they're going to certainly be able to help at least get you going as you think about inclusion in those spaces.
Thank you so much. I think our whole spectrum has been expanded. Your insight, your knowledge, helping us out figure this together. Thank you everybody for attending, being part of the session today. Thank you for your interest and knowledge, and we look forward to creating this culture together. Moving on, like we said, this is not just, while it's in the context of Pride, this is an ongoing conversation scheduled throughout the rest of the year and for many years oncoming. So thanks again, Keisha. We appreciate your availability, your time, and your knowledge.
Thank you so much, and take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.